Rain poured relentlessly over the city courthouse, turning the streets into slick rivers that reflected the flickering neon lights. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, the smell of polished wood mixed with fear. A judge banged his gavel, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Order! No further statements. This court will hear nothing more on the matter." A young woman, barely 17, sat trembling in the witness box, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes darted nervously to the gallery, searching for any sign of support, any spark of hope. But the courtroom felt like a prison. Her father had been silenced, the system had turned deaf, and the man who had threatened her family smiled smugly, knowing the law was now on his side. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, another kind of storm was brewing, a storm that no legal gavel could suppress. In the shadowed alley across the courthouse steps, the deep growl of engines began to pierce the downpour. Headlights cut through the darkness like blades, and the unmistakable roar of leather and steel filled the air. These weren't ordinary bystanders, they were riders who had carved their own code of justice on highways and backstreets. The young woman didn't know them yet, but destiny had chosen them. Each biker carried scars, not from crimes like this, but from a world that had often ignored the powerless. Tonight, their engines were not just machines, they were thunder announcing that silence would no longer reign. She glanced again at the courtroom door, where the judge's words still hung like chains in the air. "I can't speak," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. But outside, the bikers' engines roared louder, as if responding to her plea. Somewhere between fear and hope, between despair and courage, a reckoning was about to ignite, a reckoning that would break the walls of silence forever. The rain didn't stop, but neither did the engines. And in that moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether justice would arrive, or remain forever unheard. Her name was Emily Carson, and the world had been unkind to her from the start. At just 17, she carried burdens far heavier than most adults. Her mother had passed away when she was a child, leaving her with a father who tried, but couldn't shield her from the cruelties of life. School should have been a sanctuary, but instead, it became a daily battlefield. There were whispers, sneers, and a teacher whose authority had twisted into intimidation. Behind the closed doors of the classroom, Emily had become a prisoner of fear. Her tormentor, Mr. Dalton, was a man who wore respectability like armor, hiding the menace beneath. He had a way of making her small, of making her doubt herself so deeply that even the simplest truths felt like dangerous lies. Complaints had been filed. Parents had spoken. Yet every time Emily tried to raise her voice, doors slammed shut, meetings were postponed, and the law seemed to tilt in favor of the powerful. Even the local authorities, those meant to protect, looked the other way, dismissing her concerns with patronizing nods. At home, her father's frustration was palpable. Mark Carson had always been a man of principle, but he wasn't a fighter by nature. He worked long hours to provide for Emily, and when he tried to shield her from the mounting pressure, the reality of their helplessness crashed down. The fear in Emily's eyes mirrored his own, a fear that the world had no place for her innocence, that her voice would be crushed before it could ever matter. Emily clutched her notebooks like shields, each page a silent scream, each scribbled word a desperate attempt to document what no one would acknowledge. Her friends had tried to offer support, but even they were powerless against the system that Mr. Dalton manipulated so effortlessly. Every court appearance, every hearing, seemed designed to confuse, intimidate, and silence her. She felt invisible in a world that demanded she stay quiet, yet she couldn't, her heart refused to surrender entirely. And that was when the threads of fate began to shift. Somewhere in the city, far from the sterile courtroom and the suffocating fear of her daily life, a group of riders, bikers who lived by their own unspoken code, heard whispers of her story. They didn't come because it was easy. They came because they had seen the powerless crushed by those who wielded authority like a weapon. They had their own scars, their own losses, but they understood one truth: when the law fails the innocent, someone must rise to fill the gap. Emily didn't know it yet, but her silent pleas had reached ears that refused to ignore them. A chain of courage was forming, one forged not in courtrooms, but on asphalt, under stormy skies, with engines thundering like a heartbeat of justice. The stage was set. Fear and courage danced on the precipice of a night that would change everything. And somewhere, just beyond the courthouse doors, a storm of a very different kind was gathering, ready to roar. The courtroom doors slammed shut again, echoing like a final verdict over Emily's fragile hope. Mr. Dalton smirked, his confidence swelling with every nod of approval from the judge. He knew the rules, the loopholes, and the fear he had meticulously cultivated. Every word he had whispered behind closed doors had left scars deeper than anyone could see, and now, with the law seemingly on his side, he felt untouchable. Emily's heart pounded as she sat frozen in her seat. The room seemed to shrink around her, suffocating her with the weight of injustice. Every gavel strike felt like a hammer against her spirit, every silence a chain wrapped tighter around her courage. She had tried to speak, to explain, to make someone understand, but the judge had silenced her. And worse, the world outside seemed to mirror the courtroom, indifferent, compliant, unwilling to confront the truth. Outside the courthouse, the storm had grown fiercer, as if nature itself sensed the darkness thriving within. Thunder rolled across the city, shaking windows and rattling nerves. Yet inside, the villain grew stronger, unchallenged, his arrogance feeding on her despair. He began making subtle threats, confident that Emily's fear would paralyze her family. Whispers in the hallways carried messages meant to intimidate: "You can't win. No one will listen." Mark Carson watched helplessly, his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of his daughter's fear bore down on him like lead. He knew he couldn't fight this alone. Every call to authorities, every attempt at legal defense, had been met with delays, dismissals, and indifference. The walls of the system weren't just unyielding, they were actively shielding the predator. Emily's resolve trembled, but deep within her, a spark refused to die. She couldn't speak now, but she wouldn't disappear quietly. The threat loomed larger by the minute, a tidal wave of intimidation and injustice ready to consume her entirely. And just when it seemed that hope had abandoned them, a distant, familiar sound cut through the storm, a low, rumbling growl that didn't belong to thunder. Somewhere, beyond the courtroom's oppressive walls, a force was gathering. Engines warmed, tires gripped wet asphalt, and shadows shifted in perfect unity. A promise of justice was approaching, not through laws or gavel strikes, but through courage, loyalty, and the roar of wheels against the storm. Emily didn't know who would come, or when, but the first sign of reprieve had arrived. And with it, the first thread of hope began to weave through the darkness. The rain pelted the streets in relentless sheets, turning the city into a mirror of chaos and reflection. Then, a distant sound rose above the storm, a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the pavement, shaking the very air around the courthouse. At first, it was almost imperceptible, blending with thunder, but then it grew, swelling into a symphony of engines that demanded attention. One by one, headlights pierced the darkness, cutting through the rain like sharp blades. Bikers emerged from the shadows, each rider a silhouette of strength and defiance. Leather jackets glistened with raindrops, chrome gleamed under the streetlights, and every engine spoke the same language: justice was coming. They didn't need introductions. They didn't need permission. They were brothers and sisters bound not by blood, but by a code older than any law: protect the innocent, confront injustice, and never back down. Each rider had their own scars, their own battles, yet they shared a singular purpose tonight: to make sure Emily's voice would finally be heard. As they circled the courthouse, the sound of their engines echoed off the walls, filling the city with a sense of anticipation. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, umbrellas forgotten, phones lifted instinctively to capture a moment that felt almost mythic. The storm seemed to bow to them, the rain no longer a threat but a curtain revealing their presence. At the front, a tall figure with a weathered helmet slowed, the engine's growl dropping to a deliberate purr. He was the unspoken leader, known in whispered stories across the city as a man who showed up when all hope seemed lost. His eyes, visible just beneath the visor, scanned the courthouse. He saw Emily, small and trembling, and his jaw tightened with resolve. Tonight, silence would be broken. Behind him, the others lined up in perfect formation, a moving fortress of steel and determination. The unity of the group was palpable. They didn't speak much, but their movements communicated everything: loyalty, courage, and an unwavering refusal to let fear dominate. Every twist of the throttle, every flash of chrome was a signal to the world. Someone had to stand up when the law failed, and they had chosen tonight. The storm and the bikers' engines created a rhythm, a heartbeat that reached Emily even inside the suffocating courtroom. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. The world wasn't entirely silent. Somewhere, beyond the walls that sought to confine her, justice had taken a form that no gavel could ignore. The leader kicked his bike into motion again, the line of bikers following in perfect synchrony. They moved with precision, yet there was poetry in their chaos: the chaotic roar of engines, the spray of rain, the shimmer of headlights forming a tapestry of cinematic intensity. They weren't just coming to a courthouse, they were coming to reclaim truth, to deliver courage, to remind the world that the powerless were never entirely alone. The city streets seemed to hold their breath as the riders approached the courthouse steps. And inside, Emily's heart began to beat in rhythm with their engines, a drum of hope in a storm of despair. Tonight, silence would end. The courthouse doors shuddered under the pounding rain, but it wasn't the storm that made them tremble, it was the roar of the bikers outside. Emily pressed her face to the glass, wide-eyed, as the engine's vibration coursed through the walls like a warning to anyone who dared uphold injustice. Inside, Mr. Dalton's confident smirk faltered. The judge's gavel no longer carried the same authority. The room had shifted from courtroom to arena. Every whisper of leather, every glint of chrome, spoke louder than law books or procedural rules. He could feel it: power had arrived, raw and undeniable, and it was coming for him. The leader of the bikers stepped forward, helmet off now, revealing eyes that burned with fierce determination. His voice, calm yet commanding, echoed into the courtroom like a ripple through still water. "She's been silenced long enough. The truth will be heard, and no gavel, no law, and no bully can stop it." Emily's father's jaw clenched, hope and disbelief colliding inside him. He had tried every legal avenue, every plea, and yet it was this unlikely army, forged on asphalt and courage, that had brought the courage he feared he no longer possessed. The bikers moved with purpose, entering the courthouse with a force that blurred the line between chaos and justice. Engines idling now became a low growl of anticipation. Each rider took a position, forming a protective ring around Emily, ensuring that no intimidation could touch her. They were not there to fight recklessly, they were there to dismantle fear, piece by piece, brick by brick. Mr. Dalton's voice wavered for the first time. "What is this? You can't, this is illegal." His protests sounded feeble against the collective presence of the bikers, each of whom had stared down life and death situations far darker than courtroom theatrics. One of the bikers, a woman with fire in her eyes and a scar that told its own story, stepped forward. She held a recorder, evidence Emily had tried to submit countless times, but had been ignored. The audio played, filling the courtroom with undeniable proof of Mr. Dalton's threats, harassment, and manipulation. Every word struck like a hammer. Every lie he had used to build his facade crumbled in the echo of truth. The judge's face paled as he listened, gavel frozen midair. No longer could he ignore the facts. No longer could he claim procedural silence as justification for injustice. Mr. Dalton's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. He realized too late that authority alone could not protect him from the storm he had provoked. Emily's voice, small but unwavering, finally pierced the tense silence. "I'm not afraid anymore." The courtroom seemed to inhale her courage. She stepped forward, supported by the biker's silent presence, and recounted the horrors she had endured, each word amplified by the undeniable proof and the weight of the bikers' solidarity. The room shifted. Bystanders whispered. The judge had no choice but to confront the truth. Mr. Dalton was held accountable, his threats exposed, his power shattered not by law alone, but by those willing to enforce justice when the system failed. Outside, the rain had slowed, the storm easing as if to witness the triumph within. Emily looked at the bikers, heroes she had never met, yet who had risked everything to ensure her voice was heard. In that moment, silence was no longer her prison, courage and justice filled its place. her father pulled her into an embrace, tears streaming down both their faces. The bikers exchanged glances, nods of quiet pride, and without a word, they melted back into the city streets, engines roaring once more, leaving behind a courtroom transformed and a life reclaimed. The courthouse steps were quiet now, the storm having passed as if the city itself was exhaling. Emily stepped outside, her eyes bright for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The rain had left the streets glistening, reflecting the morning sun like a mirror to her newfound freedom. She clutched her father's hand, feeling the warmth and strength that had always been there, now fortified by the courage they had discovered together. Mark Carson looked at his daughter, his chest tight with relief and pride. "You were never alone, Emily," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night and every failed attempt to protect her. "Not tonight." Across the street, the bikers had parked their machines and were now merely shadows among shadows, their presence both tangible and elusive. They had come, they had fought, and they had left, leaving no trace but the lingering sense that someone, some force, stood ready to defend the innocent when the world faltered. Emily caught a glimpse of their leader, giving a small nod before mounting his bike. Engines rumbled once more, fading into the distance like a promise carried on the wind. The city around them resumed its rhythm, unaware of the quiet legends passing through its streets. But for Emily, everything had changed. The fear that had once imprisoned her was replaced by confidence, the silence that had suffocated her now broken, and the memory of the bikers' thunderous arrival etched into her heart as a symbol of courage and justice. She smiled, genuinely, without hesitation, without fear. The future, once a daunting shadow, now felt like an open road, full of possibility and promise. Emily had been heard. Justice had arrived. And though the heroes of the night would vanish into the city's shadows, their impact would remain, indelibly, in the life of one young girl who refused to be silenced. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Every voice matters, and sometimes, courage arrives in the most unexpected forms.